Shalom. Welcome to Talmud for Beginners. We are on our second lesson. Last lesson, we got a quick overview of the Talmud. By the way, in that our first video, I actually made a misstatement. I said that the Talmud contains, and the Mishnah contains 66 tractates. That's absolutely not correct. I misspoke my words. It's 63 tractates. There are 66 books of the King James Version of the Bible, but there are 63 tractates to the Talmud, broken down into 6 categories. And last week we talked about, we were studying in Tractate Nedarim, which is vows, and we were studying disputes that take place in the Mishnah in Nedarim chapter 9, the first and second Mishnahs in chapter 9, between Rabbi Eliezer and the majority. And Rabbi Eliezer, and we're also the Gemara, which is on begins on page 64a of the Talmud, and continues into 64b. And so last week, or last lesson, we covered the first Mishnah. We actually covered both of the Mishnahs. We'll cover the second Mishnah again, because we went into the Gemara last week, and we covered the portion of the Gemara that elaborates on and explains elements of Nedarim 9:1, and this was the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, the majority, over the issue of whether a vow could be revoked by calling upon the issue of the honor of one's mother and one's father. In effect, weighing two different mitzvot. On the one hand, you have a mitzvah that says, a commandment that says, in Numbers chapter 30, verse 3 or verse 2, depending on the version, to keep your vows. On the other hand, we have a commandment famously in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16, that says to honor your mother and your father. And so, as is sometimes the case, we have to violate one mitzvah, one commandment, in order to keep another commandment in some situations. And so, our first Mishnah dealt with a situation in which a person has taken a vow, but then they come along after having taken the vow and they say, I wish to have my vow, be released from my vow, have my vow revoked, because the vow dishonors my mother and my father. And Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, we do this. And the sages say, no, we don't. They prohibit such releasing a vow. When it says the sages, as we said, when we read the sages have a position, or the Chochamim in the Hebrew, it means the majority. Okay, the majority of the sages. So Rabbi Eliezer was outvoted. He was overruled by the sages, which said we don't do that. And Rabbi Zadok explained why we don't do that. He gives a kol v'chamer, a light and heavy argument. In other words, he argues from greater weight. If X is true of Y, it must even more so be true of Z, because Z is of even greater weight. And so he says, if we don't loose a vow by calling upon the honor of Elohim, in other words, if we call upon the honor of Elohim, we could say, my vow should be revoked by reference to the honor of Elohim. I dishonored Elohim by taking a vow, and therefore any vow would be revocable. And if any vow would be revocable, then the mitzvah that says to keep your vows would become meaningless. So Rabbi Zadok says, he explains the sage's position, if you will, defends it in this manner. At least that's one understanding of the text. Last lesson we actually went into the nuances of exactly how the wording could be and different ways of reading it, but generally speaking, that's the understanding. And but then the sages conceded to Rabbi Eliezer that in a case that involved only a man and his mother or father, for example, if he made a vow against them, then that vow could be revoked by reference to the honor of his mother and his father. Okay, let us continue into Mishnah Nedarim 9:2. Now, before we do this, let me give a little background discussion. We said last lesson that the Mishnah and the Talmud, by their very nature, preserve the minority and the majority opinions. Okay? Unlike some situations in some kinds of literature, they didn't simply preserve their opinions or the opinions of the majority. Like the U.S. Supreme Court record, they also preserved the opinions of the minority. And there's debates over different reasons for why this was done, but it was done. And it's actually a great blessing to us, and I think we will see as we begin in our next Mishnah why it is a blessing to us, because as Nazarenes, Pharisaic positions are not always the rabbinical halacha that was established by the Pharisaic Sanhedrin at Jerusalem after the time of Yeshua, or the Pharisaic Sanhedrin at Yavne, which is all after the time of Yeshua, not necessarily binding to us as Nazarenes. Not necessarily the same position that we would hold, because we see in Acts chapter 15 the Nazarenes had their own Beit Din, their own Sanhedrin. And this is because in Matthew 18 and in Matthew 16, Yeshua says to his Talmudim, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Binding and loosing are Talmudic terms that refer to, they're idiomatic expressions in Hebrew that refer to permitting or prohibiting an activity. And the Sanhedrin, the Beit Din, the Assembly of Elders, whatever you want to call it, the Great Assembly, had different names at different times, but the Assembly of Elders, which is actually laid out in the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And Deuteronomy chapter 17 actually describes the rulings of that body as Torah and directs us to keep those rulings. But Yeshua was giving that power to his Talmudim, and so in Acts chapter 15 we see they had their own Sanhedrin. Nonetheless, the wisdom of the rulings of the Pharisaic Sanhedrin at Jerusalem and at Yavne are extremely instructive to us and a good way of studying Torah. And when we study them, we are fulfilling the mitzvah of studying Torah, because even when we study a minority opinion or a majority opinion or opinion that is not the halacha, if you will, when it is an interpretation of Torah, it is still studying Torah. And even if it is to understand what the Torah is not saying, then we learn more about what the Torah is saying by limiting process of elimination and eliminating and saying, well, this is not what it's saying, when we find a position that we don't agree with. Okay? And this is very Talmudic in itself. The Talmud says in Hagigah 15, B, I believe it is, but it's on page 15 in Tractate Hagigah. Rabbi Meir, who, by the way, we're told was concerned for the minority, Rabbi Meir, we're told of Rabbi Meir that he ate the date and spit out the seed. And finding a pomegranate, he ate the fruit but rejected the rind. Similarly, in Tractate of Vot, in the Mishnah 401, Ben Zoma says, who is wise? He who can learn from any man. In other words, we can learn even from error. And when there is error mixed in with good, we can learn from the good and reject the error. And so there is value in studying Talmud, even if we don't necessarily agree with the majority. Eliezer didn't agree with the majority. He didn't agree with the majority in our last lesson, and he disagrees with the majority again this week in this lesson. But there is still value in the fact that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is preserved, and maybe it's a better opinion, maybe it's a good opinion. So let us now go on in our Mishnah to Nedarim 9:1. It's page 64b in the Talmud. And further did Rabbi Eliezer say, they unloose a vow by reference to what happens unexpectedly. A new fact. The sages prohibit. How so? In other words, how so means, what is Rabbi Eliezer saying? If, he said, konam, which is a euphemism for korban, which is a term that is used in making a vow. In Nedarim chapter 1, we learned some of the terminology of making these vows. So a person might say, korban, be anything of mine that might benefit you, and that would mean that basically I wanted nothing to do with them, and that anything of mine was prohibited to them. Remember last lesson we said that a vow of the nature that we're talking about in Tractate Nedarim and in Numbers chapter 30, which is not a vow to the temple, that's a different kind of vow. A vow is it prohibits something, but in order to, or someone, but in order to prohibit something, I either have to own the thing, and then I can prohibit it to everyone, or if I don't own it, I can only prohibit it to myself. If he said, konam, be what I enjoy, which derives from so-and-so, and the person was appointed a scribe. Or the person was marrying off his son in the near future, and he took the vow and then said, if I'd known he'd be appointed a scribe, or that he'd be marrying off his son in the near future, I should never have made such a vow, or such an oath. Vow is a kind of an oath. Okay. If he said, konam, be this house, if I enter it, and it was turned into a synagogue. If he said, if I'd known that it'd be made into a synagogue, I would have never made such an oath. Rabbi Eliezer permits, the sages prohibit. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying if the person comes to the court, because the person would come to the court to the sages to have their vow revoked, not so much because the sages have special power to revoke vows in and of itself, but because the sages were knowledgeable of what kinds of vows could legitimately be revoked and which ones couldn't. And so one would go to the court to have the sages determine whether the vow was revocable or not, and then they would either pronounce it to be revoked or not. And to do this, they would have to hear the person's reasons. And one in Nedarim chapter 3, one of the reasons for a vow being revocable is that it was made in error. And to the classic example that's given in Mishnah and Nedarim is the man who takes a vow not to have relations with his wife because he believes at the time that she has stolen his purse. So he makes the vow and vows not to have relations with her. At some point later, he learns that she didn't steal the purse. Maybe the real villain was found, and we know who stole the purse now. Maybe something else happened. Maybe he found where he misplaced the purse. Whatever, he determines that she didn't steal the purse after all. So he goes to have the vow revoked. And so he's asked, if you knew then what you knew now, would you have made the vow? And his answer is, No, I would not have made the vow. If I'd known then that she hadn't stolen the purse, I wouldn't have made the vow. It was made in ignorance. I was short of the facts. If I'd had all the facts, I would have not have made the vow, therefore it was made in error. We discussed this in our last lesson because it had application to our Gemara, to the previous Mishnah, which is why the Talmud bunches these two Mishnot together and then follows them with the Gemara collectively, because there's a tie-in between this Mishnah and the Gemara to the previous Mishnah. So in this issue, and so Rabbi Eliezer says, if someone comes to the court and they say that I made a vow, that I would not benefit from anything that comes from, I have no enjoyment from Reuven, and sometime later Reuven becomes a scribe and I need a ketuvah, or heaven forbid I need a ketuvah as a marriage document, or heaven forbid I need a get, a bill of divorcement, or I need new tefillin, the parchment to go on my tefillin, and or the mezuzah, and the parchment for the mezuzah, and the only scribe in town is Reuven, and I've taken a vow not to benefit from Reuven. So, what do I do? I go to the court and I say, there was a yolad, is what it's called in the Mishnah, a new fact, a new thing, something born, a change of circumstances. And because of this new fact, this unexpected new fact, I wish to have my vow revoked. And Rabbi Eliezer says, sure, we can revoke your vow for that. But the majority, the sages, say, no, we don't revoke a vow for that reason. Or, another example that Eliezer gives here in our Mishnah is the example of the man who has a daughter of marrying age. This other person has, we'll call him Phil. Phil has a son of marrying age. And only problem is that I have, some point in the past, made a vow not to have any benefit from Phil. Now I have a daughter of marrying age. I need to benefit from Phil. I need to benefit from his house and his son. I need to come to an arrangement for a marriage for my daughter to see that she's taken care of. And this is not trying to get into the issues of arranged marriage, just the issue that Eliezer lays out here. And I can't do this because of my vow. Therefore, I go to have their vow revoked, and I go to the sages and I say, there's a yolad, there's a new fact here. It's an unexpected fact. I did not know that he was going to become or have a son available for marriage to my daughter. Did you know that was going to happen? If I didn't know that was going to happen, I wouldn't have made the vow. So, and the third example Eliezer gives is the individual becomes upset with a home or a business, and he walks out, he shakes the dust from his feet, as the saying goes, and he says, Korban, if I enter this house. In other words, I vow not to enter this house. So makes a vow not to enter the building again. And in the fullness of time, that building becomes the local synagogue. And now he can't go to synagogue because he made a vow not to enter the building. And Rabbi Eliezer says, in this case, we revoke his vow, but the majority of the sages say we don't. Now let's move on to our Gemara, and we're going to skip the portion of the Gemara that dealt with Nedarim 9.1, because we already covered that in our last lesson. And we're going to pick up our Gemara, because we've been reviewing up till now. But we're going to pick up our Gemara on page 64b, where it says, it repeats from our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer also ruled, a new fact may be given as an opening. So our Gemara asks, why did Rabbi Eliezer say this was okay? And Rabbi Hizda said, because Scripture says, and the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, go return unto Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought your life. It's a reference to Shemot, Exodus 4:19. And Rabbi Eliezer says, this is death. Death is it's a yolad. It's a new fact. Did not expect it to happen. I didn't expect these men to die. So, this requires a little background material, which the Talmud will give us in a few minutes. But we're going to, sometimes I believe I said this last week, that in reading the Talmud, sometimes it assumes that you know things. And sometimes it assumes that you know traditional information, or it will give that information in an age in which they were not footnotes or marginal notes or whatever, or endnotes, further on in the Gemara. Sometimes quite a bit further. In this case, fortunately, not so far. What we are told is that there is what there is, you have to understand, is that there is a tradition, a barita, which, as we said last week, a barita is a tradition from the Mishnaic period or earlier, which was not included in the Mishnah. And this particular barita mentions and tells us that Moses, had made a vow in the presence of Jethro, while in Midian, not to return to Egypt. So he made a vow not to return to Egypt. So, we know he did return to Egypt, so how did this happen? Well, Rabbi Eliezer says he was able to return to Egypt, even though he made a vow not to return to Egypt, because he found out that the men who sought to kill him were dead. And that was a new fact. And since that was a new fact, that was a yolad, it was unexpected, Rabbi Eliezer says Moshe was able to revoke his vow and return to Egypt. Death is a new fact. So, our Gemara says, but death was a new fact. This proves that a new fact is given as an opening. What then is the reason of the rabbis? In other words, why do the sages then disagree with Rabbi Eliezer? What basis could they possibly have for disagreeing with Rabbi Eliezer if in fact Rabbi Eliezer is correct? In Exodus 4:19, it is revealed to Moshe that the men that sought to kill him were dead. He made his vow because he believed the men would kill him if he returned, and therefore they sought his life if he returned. And therefore he made the vow not to return to Egypt. But a new fact arose, and that if he had known then that the men would die, he would not have made that vow. Similar, parallel, bigger scale, but similar in concept to the man who says he made the vow not to go into the synagogue, but then later it becomes a building, but later it becomes a synagogue. Or he makes the vow not to have anything to do with Reuven, and Reuven becomes a scribe. And he didn't expect Reuven to become a scribe. If he'd known then Reuven was going to become a scribe, he wouldn't make the vow. Or if he'd known that Phil was going to have a son of marrying age, at the time that he had a daughter of marrying age at some point, he would, it was an unexpected fact, maybe at the time the vow was made, neither of them even had children. But it was a yolad, a new thing, an unexpected fact, and so he wished to be released from his vow. And Rabbi Eliezer says Moshe was released from his vow because an unexpected fact. The men who sought to kill him were dead. So how could the sages possibly disagree? They argue thus, the sages, the Chachamim. Did these men die? Did they really die? Did these men die? Surely, Rabbi Yochanan said, on the authority of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. By the way, Shimon ben Yochai is the traditional compiler and editor of the Zohar. Wherever the nizim, which is quarreling, or nitzavim, standing, is mentioned, the reference is to none other than to Dathan, and Aviram. So there's a Bereta that says that that the men who sought to kill Moshe were Dathan and Aviram, because and the basis for this Bereta is that wherever we read that they were standing and quarreling, which we read in reference to the men that sought to kill Moshe, wherever we read that elsewhere in the Torah, it's always referring to Dathan, and Aviram. Problem is, Dathan and Aviram, they didn't die until the rebellion of Korah, which was sometime later, after Moshe returned to Egypt, and even after the Exodus. But, said Rabbi Lakish, they became poor. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, a man who is childless is accounted as dead, for it is written, give me children, or else I am dead. So, the rabbis say maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe they weren't dead, sorry. Maybe it was Dathan and Aviram, and we know they weren't dead because they show up later in the Exodus account, and we find that they die in the rebellion of Korah. So they didn't die. So if they didn't die, why does Exodus 4:19 tell us that they were dead? And Rabbi Lakish says, Resh Lakish says, they became poor. Maybe they became poor. We'll explain why he says this in a minute. And Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, a man who's childless is accounted as dead, for it is written, give me children or else I am dead. And it was taught, so we have now another Bereta. Now, if it wasn't for this Bereta, it would really sound like the sages were stretching and grabbing, okay? Because the sages are making the case that when it says that the men that sought to kill him were dead, it doesn't really mean that they were dead. It means that they became poor. And when it says that or Rabbi Joshua ben Levi says it means that they became they were childless. Okay. And they were poor is actually the going halakhic, if you will, argument. And it was taught, there's a Bereta that says, 4 are accounted as dead. A poor man, a leper, a blind person, and one who is childless. A poor man, as it is written, for all men are dead, which sought your life, which is, of course, Exodus 4:19. A leper, as it is written, Aharon looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said unto Moshe, let her not be as one dead. The blind, as it is written, he has set me in dark places, as they that be dead of old. And he who is childless, as it is written, give me children, or else I am dead. So the Bereta says sometimes when the Tanakh says, when the word of Elohim says that someone is dead, it doesn't mean that they're dead. Sometimes it means that they're, sometimes it's used as a euphemism. Sometimes it just means that they're poor. Sometimes it means that they're blind. Sometimes it means that they have leprosy. And sometimes it means that they are childless. Okay? So the Bereta says there's 4 kinds of people that are counted as dead, that the word dead is used as a euphemism for, in addition to those that are actually dead. And the example the Bereta uses, the proof text the Bereta uses, is Exodus 4:19, because the Bereta presumes that the other Bereta is true, that in fact the men that sought to kill Moshe were Dathan and Aviram, and we know that they were still alive after this time. And so that being the case, that means that when it says that they were dead, it meant something else, and the tradition is that it means that they were poor. And by virtue of being poor, they had lost their power and their resources and their ability to be of any real threat to Moshe. And so Moshe was able to return because those that sought him were poor, had lost their power and therefore their standing and their ability to be any real threat to him. We are now on beginning page 65a. So we're turning the page to a new page of Talmud. It says, we learned, it was taught, he who is forbidden to benefit from his neighbor can have the vow absolved only in his neighbor's presence. Now, beginning here at the top of 65a, we've actually kind of completed our analysis of Nedarim 9.2, except for a footnote. And the footnote is, it would be helpful for us to have the Bereta that tells us that Moshe made a vow not to leave, not to go back to Egypt, because that vow was referenced by Rabbi Eliezer earlier in our text and in the Mishnah. Well, indirectly in the Mishnah, but in the Gemara, when Rabbi Hizda actually tells us the basis for Rabbi Eliezer's argument. It has been taught, he who is forbidden to benefit from his neighbor can have the vow absolved only in his neighbor's presence. When do we, in other words, if I make a vow not to have any benefit from someone and I want to absolve myself of that vow, they have to be there when I absolve myself of that vow. They have to be in the courtroom, it has to be in their presence. Because if they don't, how do they know I'm not a Rasha, an evil man, a wicked man who doesn't keep my vows? You know, how do they know why it is that suddenly I'm ignoring my vow? They have to know that it was revoked. They have to be part of the process. And I also have to have the courage to face them in the court and say, I was wrong. It was taught, it was taught, he who is forbidden to benefit from his neighbor can have the vow absolved only in his neighbor's presence. Whence do we know this? Rabbi Nachman said, because it is written, and the Lord said to Moshe in Midian, go return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought your life. So we know Moshe returned when he found out that the men that sought to kill him were dead. So we know Moses went back into Egypt. He said thus to him, in Midian you did vow, go and annul your vow in Midian. How do we know that he vowed in Midian? Because it is written, and Moshe was content, vayoel, to dwell with the man. Now, Allah can only mean an oath, as it is written, and has taken an oath of him. This is not Allah like the Muslim God. This is a word for an oath. And also against King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so here we have an example that tells us sort of a case law going all the way back to King Nebuchadnezzar, the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. There's a story that illustrates and explains to us an example and backs up this point that such a vow can only be revoked if it's revoked in front of, before the person that we made the vow concerning. And also against King Nebuchadnezzar, he rebelled who had adjured him by the living Elohim. What was the nature of his rebellion? Zedekiah had made a vow. Okay, this is all in the Tanakh. To Nebuchadnezzar. It says, what was the nature of his rebellion? Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah found Nebuchadnezzar eating a live rabbit. "Swear to me," exclaimed he. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Swear to me not to reveal this, that it may not leak out." I want you to swear to me, make a vow to me, that you will not tell anyone that you caught me eating a live rabbit. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar is the one that spent a period of time living as a wild animal, so that might tie in with this situation where Nebuchadnezzar was eating a live rabbit. He swore. So Zedekiah, we're told, made the oath. He made the vow. He vowed not to tell anyone that he saw Nebuchadnezzar eating a live rabbit. Subsequently, he grieved thereat and had his vow absolved and disclosed it. So later he regretted that he made the vow, and so he had his vow revoked. And having had the vow revoked, he then disclosed to others that he had seen, or not seen, but he had found Nebuchadnezzar eating a live rabbit. We don't know how he found him doing this. Zedekiah's eyes were put out by Nebuchadnezzar when he was taken back to Babylon. So, but he apparently discovered that it happened. When Nebuchadnezzar learned that they were deriding him, so people were making fun of Nebuchadnezzar because he had, they found out he'd been eating a live rabbit. It's kind of a weird thing to do, you know. When Nebuchadnezzar learned that they were deriding him, he had the Sanhedrin and Zedekiah brought before him. And he said to them, "Have you seen what Zedekiah has done?" So he says to the Sanhedrin, to the Jewish assembly of elders at the time, in the diaspora, in the Babylonian captivity, actually. He says to them, "Hey, have you seen what Zedekiah has done?" Zedekiah not only vowed his loyalty to me, which we read of in the Tanakh, but he vowed not to tell anybody that he discovered that I ate a rabbit while it was alive. And he said, did he not swear by the name of heaven not to reveal it? The name of heaven is actually a euphemism for Yahweh, Elohim. They answered him, he was absolved of his oath. So the Sanhedrin says, yeah, we revoked his oath. They revoked his oath. Can then one be absolved of an oath? He answered. He was absolved of his oath. He then asked them. Yes, they returned. In his presence, or even not in his presence? So Nebuchadnezzar says, can a person be revoked, be absolved of an oath? And the Sanhedrin says, well, yes, they can. And then Nebuchadnezzar says, and can they even be absolved of their oath? If the one that they made their vow concerning isn't present, if they didn't have the nerve to do it right in front of the person that they made the vow that was involved? And the Sanhedrin said, only in his presence, was their reply. How then did you act? Nebuchadnezzar says, so how did you revoke this vow? If I wasn't there, said he to them, why did you not say this to Zedekiah? Why didn't you say to Zedekiah when he asked to have the vow revoked? Why didn't you say you can only have your vow revoked in front of Nebuchadnezzar? Immediately, the elders of the daughter of Zion sat upon the ground and kept silence. In other words, the Sanhedrin know they'd done wrong. They sat down and they shut up. Rabbi Isaac says this teaches that they removed the cushion. They removed the cushions from under them. In other words, they were punished by Nebuchadnezzar, and he took their nice their cushions, and they're not, took their nice that they had, being nobles. Okay. All right, so this is the conclusion of our Gemara. Now I want to go back and kind of review a little bit. Remember, now we have a dispute here between Rabbi Eliezer and the majority of the sages. And Rabbi Eliezer, in both cases, differs with the sages. The first one we discussed was whether a vow could be loosed by reference to the honor of mother and father. And in that case, the sages somewhat agreed with Eliezer. Maybe they agreed with what Eliezer was really intending to say, because I don't know that Eliezer was intending for all vows to be revocable. And then in the second case, they don't agree with him at all. When he says that a vow can be loosed because of a yoled, because of a new fact. Now, the Jerusalem Talmud says that it can be revoked when there's a new fact, but only when the new fact is common. Why? Let me explain why the commentators at least say that the vow can't be revoked because of a new fact. And the reason that they give, typically the main reason is that if the fact was not foreseeable, then they could not have regretted it at the time they made the vow. In other words, if you say to the person, you bring them into the court and you say, would you have made the vow if you knew then what you knew now? Well, they could say yes, but what they'd be saying yes to is if I knew the future. But you can't know the future. It's different fundamentally from the situation where the man thought somebody stole money from him that didn't. And then he says, well, yes, if I'd known all the facts. But you had to have, in other words, if I knew all the facts that existed at that time. But nobody foreknows the future. So they could not have foreseen these facts, therefore they could not have regretted something that they could not have foreseen, and therefore was unknowable in the first place, and therefore they couldn't have regretted then the vow, because they couldn't have known then. These were facts that didn't exist. They're yoled. They were born. They didn't exist at the time, so they couldn't have known them at the time. That's the reasoning of the rabbis. Okay, and the Jerusalem Talmud says that actually they can if it is a common fact. And the example being right off the bat that the men became poor. Now, the reasoning, the men that sought to kill Moshe became poor. Now, this brings us to sort of our own little reasoning, and that is, one could say, if the men became poor, how is that less a new fact than they became dead, physically dead? And the position of the sages is that people become poor, and that's not unexpected. But people dying, that's unexpected. But let us really think for a minute. Everyone dies, virtually. Enoch, maybe, Elijah. You have a few isolated situations, very, very, very few. But the reality is that people die. Maybe the last generation doesn't die when the Messiah returns. But people die. Everybody dies. Okay? Not everybody becomes poor. So it's actually more likely for a person to die than it is for them to become poor, and more foreseeable. So I would think it would actually be the other way around. And this is one of the things I said. Rabbi Eliezer, maybe he's right. He's the minority. But it's a beautiful thing that the Talmud preserves Rabbi Eliezer's argument, which is a very good argument. I think it's a better argument than the majority had. I think Rabbi Eliezer was right. I think Rabbi Eliezer had a better argument than the majority. I think that Moshe was able to revoke his vow not to return to Egypt by virtue of the fact that there was a new fact. And the new fact was that the men were dead, and he didn't anticipate that the men were going to die when he made the vow. Therefore, he was able to revoke the vow, because if he had known then, he made it an error. If he'd known the men were going to die, he wouldn't have made the vow. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer perhaps is right. perhaps we should discuss who Rabbi Eliezer was. That's very, very important here, especially as Nazarenes. A very important sage. He's the sixth most commonly mentioned sage in the Mishnah. And there were several Rabbi Eliezers, but we're talking about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Eliezer, according to Avot 2:8, his teacher was Yochanan ben Zakkai. His teacher said, if all the sages of Israel were on one side of a scale, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was on the other, he would outweigh them all. That's Mishnah Avot 2:8. So the Talmud tells us that Rabbi Eliezer was the greatest sage of his time. He was better than all the other sages combined, at least in the opinion of his teacher. Something else interesting about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was accused of being what's called a menim in the Talmud, and we'll talk about that term in a minute. In the Babylonian Talmud, in Avodah Zarah 16b, starting on page 16b, bottom of 16b, and then going into 17a, said Rabbi Akiba to him, Master, will you permit me to say, in the wrong place, 16b, our rabbis taught, that's where we are, our rabbis taught, when Rabbi Eliezer was arrested because of minut is a word meaning that he was of the menim, okay, amin, mem, yud, nun, or min, they brought him up to the tribune to be judged, said to the governor to him, how can a sage man like you occupy himself with those idle things? Okay. This was during the persecutions, and so he was accused of being a mean. We'll show you later in just a minute that was in fact a Nazarene. That was the original meaning of the word. It came to have broader meaning, but initially a mean was a Nazarene. It was actually short for believers in Yeshua the Nazarene. Mem, Yud, Nun. The first letter from each word from the Hebrew phrase meaning believers in Yeshua of the Nazarene, or of Nazareth. So the judge says to him, how occupy himself with these idle things? Why would a sage of Israel occupy himself with the things of the Nazarenes? He replied, I acknowledge the judge as right. So he didn't deny it. He says, I acknowledge the judge is right. The governor thought that he referred to him, though he really referred to the Father in heaven, and said, because you have acknowledged me as right, I pardon you. You are acquitted. When he came home, his disciples called on him to console him, but he would accept no consolation. Let's pause for a minute here. So, Rabbi Eliezer is accused of being a Nazarene. He's brought before the governor, and the governor says, reads the charge to him, and then he says, what in the world is a great sage of Israel doing following the doctrine of the Menim, the Nazarenes? And Eliezer says, the judge is right. It's interesting, Yeshua said that we would be dragged before judges and so on in courts and attacked on his behalf, and that when we did, the Ruach would give us the words to say. And the Ruach gave him the words to say. He said, the judge is right. And the judge thought he was talking about him, but he was really talking about his Father in heaven. So the question is, why do you follow the doctrine of the Menim? Why would a judge, why would a sage, one of the Chachamim of the Jewish people, follow the Nazarene teaching? And his response is to the question of why he would follow the Nazarene teaching is the judge is right. The Father in heaven is right. In other words, the teaching is right. But the judge believed he was saying that the judge was right and said, I pardon you and let you go, and let him go. Okay. Afterwards, at some point, Rabbi Akiva, as the story continues, and again now towards the bottom of page 16b, said Rabbi Akiva to him, Master, will you permit me to say one thing of what you have taught me? He said, say it. Master, said he, perhaps some of the teaching of the Menim had been transmitted to you, and you did approve of it, and because of that you were arrested. So now remember, we're reading the rabbinic account of the events. So Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Zedekiah, to Rabbi Eliezer, maybe you heard some of the teaching of the Nazarenes and gave some approval to it. Could that be what happened? And maybe that's why they arrested you. He exclaimed, Akiva, you have reminded me. I was once talking in the upper market of Sepphoris when I came across one of the disciples of Yeshua the Nazarene, Jacob of Kephar Sichania by name. Some people believe this may have been James the Just. Some people may have believed the emissary James, Yaakov. He said to me, it is written in your Torah, you shall not bring the hire of a harlot into the house of Yahweh your Elohim. May such money be applied to the erection of a retiring place for the high priest. To which I made no reply. Said he to me, thus was I taught by Yeshua the Nazarene, for of the hire of a harlot has she gathered him, and unto the hire of a harlot shall they return, which is actually quoting from Micah chapter 1 verse 7. And they have gathered them into, they came from a place of filth, let them go to a place of filth. Those words pleased me very much, and that is why I was arrested for apostasy. For thereby I transgressed the scriptural words, removed your way far from her, which refers to the minute, and come not nigh to the doors of her house, which refers to the ruling power. Now, this is, of course, the rabbi's version of the story. However, despite the fact that it's kind of whitewashed at the end and tries to present an idea that maybe Eliezer wasn't really guilty, the fact is that the story indicates that he wasn't not guilty, that when he was brought before the court, he said the judge is right, referring to when he was asked why would a sage of Israel follow the Menim, he says that the judge, referring to the Father in heaven, is right. In other words, it's true. The Nazarene teaching is correct. And he didn't deny being a Nazarene, one of the Menim, and then he was pardoned because the judge misunderstood what he said. It's also true that Rabbi Eliezer was in fact excommunicated until shortly after his death because he refused to accept the position of the majority. And this brings us back to our Mishnah. Remember also Rabbi Eliezer's position in Nedarim 9:1 that we studied last week, very close to Yeshua's position in Matthew chapter 15, that a vow could be revoked by virtue of calling upon the honor of a man's father and mother. Okay, so we have another important account concerning Rabbi Eliezer. Make sure I started in the right place here. Okay, it has been taught there was a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the other sages, one of many. And at this point, Rabbi Eliezer had it up to here with agreeing with the minority, following the majority position. I'm sorry. He was right. He knew he was right. He knew his position was right, and he knew they were wrong. So it says it has been, this is in the Talmud. By the way, the last one, yeah, this is in the Talmud in Baba Metzia 59b. It has been taught, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but they did not accept them. Said he to them, if the halacha agrees with me, in other words, if I'm right, let the carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place. Others affirm 400 cubits. No proof can be brought from a carob tree, they retorted. In other words, the majority of the sages say, it doesn't matter if the carob, no proof is, that doesn't prove that a halacha is right. Again he said, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flowed backwards. No proof can be brought from a stream of water, they rejoined. Again he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove it, the academy that they were meeting in. Whereupon the walls inclined and began to fall, they were about to fall, but Rabbi Joshua rebuked them, the walls, saying, when scholars are engaged in a halakhic dispute, what have you to intervene? Hence they did not fall in honor of Rabbi Joshua, nor did they resume the upright in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing thus inclined. Again, he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. So he called upon Elohim himself. Let it be proved from heaven that the halacha, my position is the right one, and you're wrong. Whereupon a heavenly voice cried out, a voice from heaven cried out, a bat kol, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer? So the voice says, why are you disputing with Rabbi Eliezer? Now remember, our Mishnah this week, this lesson, Rabbi Eliezer was disagreeing with the majority. Why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer? Seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him. Not just this matter that they were debating right there, but in all matters. In other words, this voice was saying, in all of Rabbi Eliezer's disputes that he has had with you, he was right and you were wrong. Whenever he disagreed with the majority, Rabbi Eliezer was actually the one that was right. The majority were wrong. That's what the voice from heaven said. Why did you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him? This reminds me of the voice from heaven that said to Paul, why do you persecute me? But Rabbi Joshua arose and exclaimed, it is not in heaven. Quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. It is not in heaven. What did he mean by this? Said Rabbi Jeremiah, that the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice because you have long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority one must incline. In other words, the Torah was given at Mount Sinai already. The Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that the sentence of the courts is Torah. Therefore, the majority rules, and the halakha established by the assembly is of judges, is binding, is right, and it doesn't matter if a voice from heaven says otherwise, because a voice from heaven can't contradict, Yahweh can't contradict himself, so a voice from heaven can't doesn't, in other words, Elohim gave us the authority, he no longer therefore has it. I'm not saying that. That's what Rabbi Jeremiah says. Rabbi Nathan met Elijah and asked him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do in that hour? He laughed with joy, he replied, saying, my sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me. So the rabbinic position is that the sages defeated Elohim, kind of like Jacob wrestling with the angel. They defeated Elohim. They their argument was that Elohim, judicial authority, having given them the halakhic authority, no longer had it himself, and that the majority position is the right position, even if a voice from heaven, from Elohim, says otherwise. It was said on that day, all objects which Rabbi Eliezer had declared clean were brought and burned in fire. In other words, they revoked all of his previous rulings that this or that was clean, and they assumed it was unclean. They then took a vote and excommunicated him. Said they, who shall go and inform him? Who's going to... They were kind of cowards about it. Who's going to go tell Rabbi Eliezer that we excommunicated him? The greatest sage of his time. But he was a Minim. He was a Nazarene. And he was right when they were wrong. To the point that even a voice from heaven spoke out from heaven and said, Rabbi Eliezer's been right all along and you guys have been wrong. And they still wouldn't accept it. Who shall go and inform him? I will go, answered Rabbi Akiva. Lest any suitable person go and inform him, and thus destroy unsuitable person go and inform him, and thus destroy the whole world. In other words, they were afraid that if somebody did this wrong and went and told Rabbi Akiva, who had the backing of Elohim himself, the voice of Elohim, saying, Rabbi Akiva's right and you're wrong, that the whole world might be destroyed if this wasn't handled gingerly. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He donned black garments and wrapped himself in black and sat at a distance of 4 cubits from him. He was afraid to get too close to him. Because maybe he'd get struck down. Akiva, said Rabbi Eliezer to him, what has particularly happened today? Master, he replied, it appears to me that your companions hold aloof from you. Thereupon he too rent his garment, put off his shoes, removed his seat, and sat on the earth, whilst tears streamed from his eyes. The world was then smitten. 1/3 of the olive crop, 1/3 of the wheat, and 1/3 of the barley crop. Some say the dough in the women's hands swelled up. A Tana taught, in other words, a sage from the Mishnaic period taught, great was the calamity that befell that day, for everything at which Rabbi Eliezer cast his eyes was burned up. Rabbi Gamaliel, too, was traveling in a ship when a huge wave arose to drown him. It appears to me he reflected that this is on account of none other but Rabbi Eliezer ben Hechronus. Thereupon he arose and exclaimed, Sovereign of the universe, you know full well that I have not acted for my honor, nor for the honor of my paternal house, but for yours, so that strife may not multiply in Israel. In other words, the only reason I did this, even if it meant standing against the voice of Elohim, was to keep Israel united. At that, the raging sea subsided. That's hard to believe at times that that's the rabbinic account. That's the rabbinic account of the events. So Rabbi Eliezer was excommunicated for refusing to accept the rulings of the Pharisaic Sanhedrin. And he had the voice of Elohim on his side, declaring that his halachot were correct and their halachot were wrong. So we have every reason to say, in studying Nedarim 9.2 and even 9.1, but the sages agreed at least in part with him in 9.1. In 9.2, we have every basis for saying Eliezer was right, that the minority was right. And it's wonderful that the Talmud preserves for us Rabbi Eliezer's argument, his position, and the reasoning of his argument, which is, I think, better than the reasoning that the sages had. So we have the minority position. I think it's the Nazarene position. Eliezer was a Nazarene. It's the so it's the I believe it's the Nazarene position. Now, that being said, there's still a lesson to be learned about from this passage of Mishnah and Gemara in the Talmud, and that is, in taking vows, the unexpected can happen, and we as human beings, very limited in our knowledge and ability, cannot take into account everything that might happen. We don't know the future. We're not Elohim. We're not Elohim. And so this, I believe, is why Yeshua does not absolutely prohibit, but it certainly discourages vows, taking vows, and taking unnecessary oaths. I mean, there's some cases in the Torah where we're required to take an oath, but there's we're talking about oaths that don't need to be taken. And in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 33, it says, "Again you have heard that it was said to them of old, you shall not forswear yourself, but you shall pay to Yahweh your vow." And this is in part a reference back to Numbers 30, verse 3 or verse 2, to keep your vow, which is the part of the issue that we're discussing in Nedarim chapter 9, and really throughout Nedarim. "But I tell you that you shall not swear by confirming word, nor by heaven, for it is Elohim's throne." I would say we actually are prohibited from making these kinds of vows, but once a vow is made, then the issue is, can it be revoked? "But I tell you, you shall not swear," again repeating it, "you shall not swear by confirming word, not by heaven, for it is Elohim's throne, and not by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, and not by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king." And you, in other words, you don't have control over these things. You're not Elohim. It's not, earth isn't your footstool. Okay? It's not, heaven isn't your throne. Jerusalem isn't your city. It's the city of the great king. In verse 36, "You shall not swear by your head, in that you have no power to whiten one hair or turn it black again." In other words, you have no power over these things. "But let your own words be yes, yes, no, no, for whatever is more than these words is of evil," or is of evil. Okay, so Yeshua says don't make vows. And why does Yeshua tell us not to make vows at all? He puts a fence around the Torah, because the Torah says to, this is another Talmudic principle, the Torah tells us not to keep our vows. But Yeshua says, okay, keep your vows, but even better, don't make them. So it's put a fence around the Torah, so if you don't make a vow, you don't have to worry about keeping it. And why would you not make a vow? Because you're not Elohim. You don't know what's going to happen. Maybe there will be a Yoled. Maybe there will be an unexpected fact. Maybe something will happen that is unexpected. You don't control what happens. Elohim does. Okay, so that's it for this week's study, and we'll cover another section of Talmud in our next study. So I hope you'll join us for lesson 3 in Lessons in Talmud. Shalom.